Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank. Mike, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Thanks, Robbie. Thanks for having me. My name is Mike Rembis. I am a history professor at the University at Buffalo. I'm also a disability studies scholar and have been part of the disability rights movement for about 30 years now.
How'd you get interested in studying disabilities?
I got interested in studying disability history and disability studies more broadly when I was in graduate school. I actually came to it from the history of science. Believe it or not, I was interested in the history of science. I was interested in the history of how scientific knowledge gets created, and I became interested in thinking about sort of what's called the social construction of knowledge, systems of knowledge and power and that sort of thing. And I became interested in studying eugenics, the history of eugenics, as a science, as an early 20th century science, and thinking about it critically, thinking about who supported it, who spoke out against it, what kind of effects it had on society, on policy, on laws and things. Um, and then through that, through the history of eugenics, I became interested in the history of disability because eugenicists in the early 20th century played a really prominent role in defining what was considered a disability. They also were interested in institutionalizing people they considered disabled, sterilizing people they considered disabled, even in the case of Nazi Germany, murdering people that they considered disabled. So it was through that, through the history of science and eugenics, that I became interested in disability and disabled people and thinking about their experiences.
So is there a strong relationship between disabilities and eugenics? I never thought of it like that before, but it kind of makes sense when you kind of look at like the template of how people consider what is normal. Like that's a weird question to ask anybody, what is normal? And it seems like today there's just so many different various personalities out there that I guess it's because it's been, I hate to say the word, but it's become more normalized to be kind of an individual self. But back in the day, there was just 9 to 5 work. I mean, there's still 9 to 5 workers, but there was more of a cut style of like, you dress in your business clothes, you act whatever till whenever you get off work, and then you can do whatever in your free time. But there was no public display of just, I mean, I have ADHD, so I'm constantly acting out. And for a lot of people, it's a lot. But that's more normal now. I see a lot of people kind of just being themselves and not really caring as much. And it just the eugenics connection. I've never thought of that.
Yeah, and one of the things that's really unique about my work, the unique contribution that I've made to the scholarship over the years, is thinking about the relationship between disability and eugenics and how eugenics is really all about disability. It's of course also important that we consider race and gender and class and those things as well in connection with disability, but eugenics was really very intimately linked with disability in the early 20th century, and the legacies of eugenics, I think, still influence the way we think about disability. And so, for example, I mean, eugenicists were very interested in defining who they considered to be fit and unfit citizens. So thinking a lot about normality and what was normal, what was a normal body, what was normal intelligence, who was fit enough to be married, who should be prevented from being married, who was fit enough to be in society, who should be segregated in an institution or sterilized, or as I said, murdered in some cases. And so, yeah, I mean, from my perspective as a historian, I think that eugenics is very closely linked with disability, and disability is really important to thinking about eugenics, because eugenics was a worldwide phenomenon. I think it was most prominent perhaps in the U.S. and in Nazi Germany, but it existed everywhere in the world. And different parts of the world, different countries had different approaches to thinking about eugenics and to enacting eugenic policy. But the one thing that was common throughout the world was thinking about what is normal and what is a normal body, and what is normal intelligence and normal behavior and that sort of thing, and trying to eliminate that and remove that from society through eugenic measures.
When it comes to, I guess, a normal baseline that they're going off of, I mean, when did it start? Like, was it a class? Did they have classification tests back in the day, like reading and certain things? Like, I know we have some tests today that obviously can tell you where your, I guess, average or IQ kind of falls in a sense. But I mean, back then, what kind of measures did they have to be able to detect if somebody was disabled? I mean, I know about a lot of mental institutions. There's actually had someone on the show named Nancy Weiss, and she was in charge of helping get that Judge Rotenberg Center that was torturing disabled people. I mean, that's still going on today. But back in the day, I mean, that was way more common. I mean, common. People just thought like they don't know what to do. Parents didn't know what to do. So it was like, send your kid away and let this institution have whatever. But I was like, well, how do you know if a kid just doesn't have so much energy? Like I would have been one of those kids put in an institution.
Yeah, I mean, could have very well been, and up through the mid 20th century, through the 1950s or 60s, that was the dominant kind of paradigm. That was the advice that doctors gave parents if somebody was, if a child appeared to be disabled, the advice was to put them in an institution, that they would be a burden on the family, that they would disrupt the upbringing of their siblings, that they would put too much of a strain on the relationship of the parents. And so they were encouraged to institutionalize people. And that was one of the legacies of the eugenics movement, really. I mean, institutionalization existed before the rise of eugenics around the turn of the 20th century, but during the decades of eugenics from about 1900 to the 1940s, a number of institutionalized people in the United States swelled significantly and by the mid 1950s, there were almost 600,000 people in institutions in the US. But your question was about how do we measure? And it's a really interesting question because it was in the 19th century that the science of statistics was invented by various scientists. Carl Pearson was a prominent statistician during the early years, a UK statistician. But so people use the science of statistics and statistical measurement to create what we now call the bell curve, to create this kind of, the mean and the median and the kind of a distribution from a normal measurement. And so people started to measure bodies and minds in those ways by gathering a lot of data and trying to determine averages and things, and the distance away from the average that various people were. And Charles Francis Galton, the founder of eugenics, was a avid statistician and avid counter. He was another British guy. He coined the term eugenics in 1883, and he was very interested in counting and gathering that type of data. And then around the turn of the 20th century, Alfred Binet and his partner Theodore Simon in France invented the intelligence test, which Henry Goddard brought to the United States in 1908, and was translated from French to English. And so intelligence tests after 1908 were used on institutionalized populations, on prisoners, on new immigrants at Ellis Island, and various other places to determine intelligence. And actually, the Stanford revision of the Binet test, which was in 1916, became a very prominent intelligence test and continued to be used throughout the remainder of the 20th century. And it's really interesting. I mean, a lot of the standardized tests that school children took up until the end of the 20th century were based on those early intelligence tests. And so that was a way of determining intelligence and deciding whether somebody was feeble-minded, as it was called at the time, or unintelligent. There were also psychology became a big sort of uh, science around the turn of the 20th century, especially childhood psychology. And then psychiatry as well became more formally organized by the early 20th century. And all of these different disciplines were developing ways to measure people, to measure bodies, to measure people's intelligences, to talk about their personalities and things. And so that's how eugenicists, um, determined whether people were fit or unfit, or what we might call today disabled or not disabled.
Well, compared to when the test came over here to when they actually, I mean, how many misreadings did they get on people? How many kids were put into an institution that necessarily weren't mentally disabled, but maybe just had maybe a slight issue with learning or cognitive function when it came to maybe, I mean, a kid reading something, if he can't read properly, it could be dyslexia. It couldn't be, like, so how accurate were the tests? I mean, how many people were sent away, I guess, improperly?
Yeah, well, I mean, the tests are really interesting. You could actually Google Binet intelligence tests, and somebody could Google that and actually see the tests and try to take them. They were very culturally specific. I think most people today would fail those intelligence tests just because they're not aware of early 20th century culture, and so they might not do well on them. And there was a lot of discussion and debate at the time of the tests that they were not accurate. They didn't accurately measure intelligence. There was debate about what intelligence was, that, that we can't really measure intelligence, that there's so many different ways that intelligence can manifest itself. And so all these debates were taking place at the time. But initially, the results of intelligence tests um, were more or less accepted, at least until World War One. And sometimes intelligence testers found that significant percentages of populations, institutionalized populations, as I said, immigrants at Ellis Island, they were sometimes finding 60, 70, 80, 90% of those people to be what they called feeble minded. They had different grades of feeble mindedness, and the technical terms, and these are technical terms, they'll be offensive to modern listeners, but um, they divided feeble-mindedness into idiots, imbeciles, and morons. And the idea was that the intelligence test, the mental test, would allow them to assign a mental age to a person. And so somebody with a mental age of about 0 to 3 was considered an idiot. Somebody with a mental age of about 3 to 7 or 8 was considered an imbecile. And then um, and then they had somebody above the age of about, well, from above 8, up until about age 12 was considered a moron. And so there were different grades of intelligence.
I'll say when I was a kid, I was called all those. So I checked all three
Yeah, I
boxes.
know. I know they're all used as insults now, but these were technical terms in the early 20th century. An interesting thing about intelligence testing and the accuracy of it is, um, a lot of times there would be some pushback sometimes from psychologists and others who would say that the tests were, inaccurate, that they weren't measuring accurately, and people were being wrongly confined in institutions. But that was kind of a minority voice. And then in World War One, a group of about 6 psychologists, Robert Yerkes and Goddard and others, came together and convinced the federal government to allow them to test all of the army recruits that the United States government was recruiting to fight in World War One, and this is often referred to as the Army intelligence tests. Um, and so they created 2 different versions: one for native English speakers and people who were literate, so one where you had to read to take it, and they constructed another test that was supposedly meant to measure the intelligence of people who were not native English speakers or who were illiterate, and so that was a rather complicated process. But so they tested this millions of recruits, over 1 million, almost 2 million recruits to the US Army during World War One. And they found that the average intelligence of the recruits was at the moron level. It was about 12 or 13 years of age. And so that forced intelligence testers to really rethink what what those tests were doing and how they were measuring intelligence. And so there were changes that took place after that in the 20s and 30s.
When it came to, I mean, was the 20s and 30s a rise when you started seeing people that became more activists, or was there just kind of this new age of knowledge where people were just kind of walking into something that they're just now starting to get a lot more information on and better ways to be able to diagnose certain things? Because, I mean, eventually we got to a point where people are finally raising the alarm on a lot of what these institutions are doing. But I'm guessing that was after the lobotomy came into the picture, because that to me is nuts. I can't believe that that's a real thing and that's actually was done to people. But and how do you perfect that? I don't, to me, that's like a fragile thing. Anything with your brain, I feel like, you could slip up and really mess it up, even with modern day technology. But back then, they're like, let me just take this ice pick and, scramble a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, those kinds of things, they've been criticized on a number of fronts. I mean, some people refer to things like lobotomy and ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, as brain damage, is nothing is is doing nothing more than just causing brain damage. But um, this question about it, whether there was resistance within institutions. So increasing numbers of people were being institutionalized, as I said, by the early 20th century, in part because of the rise of eugenics. And people were advocating, that some people were advocating that various people with mental health problems or even intelligence, concerns about people's intelligence or other kinds of disabilities, things today we might think of as epilepsy or other types of disabilities. People were encouraging those folks to be institutionalized. Um, there was a lot of resistance to that as well, especially among former asylum inmates, former institution inmates. And it's something I write about in my new book that's going to come out next year, with Oxford University Press. Since the early 19th century, when institutions were first created, um, former inmates, people who had spent time in them, were very vocal and critical of the institutions. They wanted to reform them. They wanted to secure inmates' rights when they were in institutions, rights to have visitors, rights to use the mail to communicate to people. And ultimately, they wanted as many people to remain in the community as possible and to not be institutionalized, because they didn't think that they were very good places to be. They weren't really therapeutic. They were more custodial. And so there was pushback from a number of former inmates of institutions throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century. Um, and then institutions became so crowded by the early 20th century that states and some physicians became pretty desperate, in trying to um, empty out the institutions and trying to figure out ways to enable people to leave the institutions and to, in their minds, quote, cure them of their mental troubles. And so by the teens and 20s and 30s and 40s, we see an increasing number of what are called somatic treatments being used on institutionalized populations. So, um, for example, there was a physician in New Jersey who thought that that sort of severe infection, caused mental health problems, and so he started pulling all of the teeth of the people that were in his institution, started performing surgeries, removing sections of their colon, because the idea was he thought that they were septic, that they were infected in various ways, and that relieving that infection would improve their mental state. And so in the teens and 20s, he did that in his institution. And then by the 20s and 30s, physicians were using metrazole, shock therapy, insulin coma therapy, and then electric shock therapy. And then by the 1940s, lobotomy, to try to treat patients. But these were really kind of barbaric treatments that they were using on people.
Now, were they allowed to explore methods like that? Like, I have a feeling each institution's probably trying something different or trying to find, because a lot of that time, like I kind of see it as like they have a bulletin board and they're like, we're going to try this tomorrow. We're going to try this. Not that they want to hurt the person. It's just that they're all kind of exploring, like, how do we try and help this person or fix this person? Because I mean, look how people are viewing it. People are either, and I'll ask your personal opinion on this, there are family members or parents that probably like, I don't know how to give the kid the best life or whatever. And these people say they can handle it. There's definitely a large amount of that. But there's also a large amount of people that are like, I don't really want to deal with this. Maybe they'll be able to help. And it's like two different, they're kind of similar, but two different perspectives. But that kind of allows, like, why didn't the parents check in on their kids when they shipped them to institutions? Nobody ever listened to anybody in a sane asylum or any mental institution. It's just the way we've stigmatized it kind of in this country for so long, where it's getting a better rep, I think, a little bit now. It's kind of taking a little bit of a turn. But back in the day, it was like, you could do whatever you wanted to these people because no one's going to believe them anyway because they're in here. And nobody wants to go there and interview any of those people.
Well, and that's a big reason why I wrote this book that's going to come out next year. I really wanted to think about what people who were in institutions were saying, because for so long they've been dismissed by historians and by other people. Their testimony, their writing, what they said in the press and other places has been dismissed as unreliable because they were labeled with a mental health um, problem or issue, or label, and so they weren't taken seriously. They're as I said, they're kind of what they wrote and what they thought and said wasn't taken seriously, and so that's really what motivated me to write this new book, is to actually look at what they said and look what they were saying about their experiences, and then I ultimately discovered, that they had really sophisticated critiques of the asylum, as I call it, of institutions. They ended up forming friendships and networks with one another. They ended up advocating to reform the institutions. They went and testified before state legislatures when state legislatures would conduct investigations of institutions. If journalists would kind of call institution administrators out on how they were treating people, the state would come in and do an investigation. And often former inmates would testify and speak before these legislative committees and things. And so they were vocal, they were active, they were speaking out, and I found that it's a really valuable source. Their words and their experiences are a real valuable source for thinking about the history of institutions, and that has been largely ignored to this day. So I was really excited, to write this new book, that I wrote. But then you were also saying, I mean, I think you're right in saying that there are different attitudes that families had toward their institutionalized kin. I mean, many families tried to remain as involved as they could with the people that they institutionalized. They institutionalized them because they were overburdened. They couldn't take care of them. They didn't have the resources to take care of them, or physicians kind of, strongly suggested or insisted that they institutionalize someone. But many tried to remain in touch with their institutionalized kins. Of course, not everyone did. And some people were just kind of abandoned in institutions. So there's a real variety of experiences that families went through, when they did ultimately decide to institutionalize someone. And it was often a difficult decision, not always, but often was a difficult decision. And I think by the mid 20th century, by the 1950s and 60s, it's those ex-inmates, that I write about in the earlier period. My book looks at 1830 to 1950. But it's those ex-inmates, it's family members, and some physicians and therapists and others who by the mid 20th century, by the 1950s and 60s, start to argue, publicly, that we need to do something about these institutions. We need to close them. We need to move people out and put people in the community, and support them in the community. And I think we're still kind of dealing with that today, even in the 21st century, where we still don't have the supports in place that a lot of people need, and people are involuntarily committed and things against their will, and so there's still issues that we're still grappling with today related to the history of institutions.
I just want to clarify one thing. You mentioned prisoners. Are you talking about like convicts?
Um, well, I was calling people in institutions inmates, so I wouldn't refer to them as prisoners. And I don't do the history of prisoners. Other folks do really want excellent histories of prisoners, and incarceration in that way. But I like to think of actually of institution. People might refer to them as patients, and they might refer to themselves as patients. But a lot of people who do the history of institutions refer to them as inmates, or ex-inmates, because they were essentially incarcerated. They were committed often against their will. They were sometimes, they were usually held against their will and not allowed to leave. There wasn't much in the way of treatment, so it was largely custodial. They were largely just living in the institutions. And so in many ways, they were like inmates, and not like we would think of a patient in a hospital nowadays.
The reason why I asked that was because when we talk about like just actual convicts, and then we also talk about people with disabilities or people that are locked in insane asylums or institutions like that. It's the dehumanization where immediately anything that they say, it's like calling somebody an anorexic. A doctor's not going to listen to that person for like a month until they figure out that person's not an anorexic because it's an illness, and they consider this mental illness as everything that they say they're going to lie or they're going to do whatever just to get their point across or get their whatever. And that's an issue. And it's when do we find that? And I'm going to ask you this is about news reporting. When did news stations actually start going into these institutions and going into trying to find out what these people are saying, looking at their statements, taking statements from them? Because that whole aspect of dehumanization, nobody's going to it's they're not going to validate this person at all. And it could be true and it could be happening. There were people that were blowing, abuses on institutions, whistleblowing on it way before we actually started getting actual work done on it. And it's just the whole factor of nobody bothered to go over there. It was seen as like, that's the government, or that's, a problem, or that's a health thing. You don't need to go over there. And then when people started going over there, they started realizing, okay, there's people that are being abused. This isn't treatment. This is a lot of like ethical rights issues. And that's kind of where we get into the changing society today, where I feel like now more people understand disabilities, but they don't really know the full history of disabilities.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that dehumanization is really important. And you asked earlier too about kind of how why institution administrators or institution physicians were doing some of these really drastic, taking these really drastic measures to try to quote cure their patients, like lobotomy or shock or surgery and that sort of thing. And part of it is because they were dehumanized. Once they were institutionalized, they were seen as sort of a diagnosis or a case, or something to be treated or cured, but they were really kind of dehumanized. And that's another thing I try to do in my new book is really kind of restore their humanity in a lot of ways and think about them as whole, complex people with rich lives and rich histories, and to humanize them in that sense. So I think you're right. I mean, I think there is a significant amount of dehumanization that takes place when people are institutionalized. And the people that I look at were speaking out against the asylum, since the first asylums were built in the early 19th century, but really, and so that kind of momentum built up over the decades. And then in World War II, conscientious objectors to World War II some of them did their service in institutions, and they smuggled in cameras, and they took down notes and they wrote stories. And so in the 1940s there were a series of exposés, from these COs, from these conscientious objectors, that appeared in like Life magazine and other really high profile places. And this wasn't the first time that the news media paid attention to the institutions. Another thing that I show in my book is that news media was very much involved, since the 19th century in thinking about these institutions. But it was really in the 1940s, and right after World War II, when these COs released these reports, that it became national news, because now people were thinking about these institutions within the context of the Nazi atrocities and the Nuremberg trials and the UN Convention on Human Rights, which was at that same time. And so it becomes a real politicized issue after World War II. And then, as I said, families and ex-patients or ex-inmates, as they call themselves, and other allies, continue to kind of push people to investigate the institutions. And then, so by the 1960s, you have people like Robert Kennedy going into institutions and really calling attention to the condition within institutions. Christmas in Purgatory is a feature, expose that comes out in the 1960s that reveals what it's like to be in an institution. And then Geraldo Rivera in the early 1970s took news cameras into the Willowbrook Institution on Staten Island in New York, and that had a significant effect. When people saw the inside of Willowbrook on their TV screens, that really affected the course of what's usually called deinstitutionalization, of closing institutions and moving people out. There was a class action suit after that. Parents of institution inmates went to court and sued. And there was a consent decree, which is called the Willowbrook Consent Decree, that and the court said that they had to empty out Willowbrook by the 1980s. This was like the mid 1970s, so they had about a decade to move everybody out of Willowbrook, and that had a large effect on institutions across the country. And so deinstitutionalization began, or rather gained significant momentum in the 1970s and 80s. And now some people would argue that it wasn't really a process of deinstitutionalization, but what they call trans institutionalization. So many people were moved into nursing homes, or group homes, or ended up in jails and prisons. So just different other types of institutions. They were moved out of the large state hospitals, but there were no real resources for them, no supports for them. There was supposed to be community mental health centers, but they were vastly underfunded. And so, some people argue that it was more of a process of trans institutionalization, of moving people from one type of institution to several different types of institutions. And I think that's kind of still what we're dealing with even today in the 21st century.
Well, the institutions have like legs, they move.
Yeah.
Once you close
Yeah.
down one, there's another one that pops up right down the street or something. But yeah, I remember looking at the pictures for Willowbrook State School. I think it was an old army hospital, if I'm not mistaken on that. But the pictures are just so awful. There's like 50 to like 100 people put in like a closet like room, and they're naked. And it's like, any parent watching that and they see, oh, this is where my kid was sent, and you're just going to immediately snap. Something instinctually inside of you just freaks out. I think that was a big shock for a lot of people, but I mean, it is that transfer of care. I mean, if they just closed down that institution, I mean, what else followed afterwards of that? I mean, the understanding still, I think we're turning it around. I think, Robert Kennedy, it's interesting you mentioned that, just because with some of my past JFK episodes, I think that's in part because of his sister that got a lobotomy. I mean, we've never really had anybody. Usually, you don't look into something unless either it's something that you just, I guess, taken back by, but a lot of times it's because you're connected in some way. His sister getting a lobotomy. I mean, he had that interest. No other president really had someone that had a lobotomy that was there. So his interest of going after these institutions. I mean, but do we have an organization that really looks through all these institutions today? I mean, did they even have ideas about a governing body that could even do that back then?
Um, well, I mean, there are a bunch of different organizations, I think, that have formed. I mean, the forerunner of the American Psychiatric Association was the Association of Medical Superintendents of Asylums for the Insane, American Asylums for the Insane, and that became the American Psychiatric Association. So professionals had their own organizations, but patients, former inmates formed their own groups, their own kind of organizations and groups where they looked into institutions, and certainly, yeah, the Kennedy administration was instrumental. They had been kind of pushed by state governors who went to the federal government and said, we the states can't afford these institutions. We can't maintain them. They're overcrowded. They're underfunded. They're awful places to be. And so in the after the war, late 40s, 50s, state governors pushed the federal government to kind of take control over at least funding institutions. And so then that led to, under the Kennedy administration, the creation of this Community Mental Health Centers Construction Act, which was meant to, it didn't give any funding to the big giant state institutions. It was meant to fund community mental health centers, and so that was kind of the funding, at least the initial funding source behind deinstitutionalization. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the Kennedys were really interested in that because their sister had been lobotomized and put in an institution in Wisconsin, I believe, where she lived a very long time. I think she was in her 80s or maybe even 90 when she died, and she was institutionalized her entire life.
Have you ever heard one of these videos after someone gets a lobotomy?
I haven't necessarily seen a video, but I've read a bunch of memoirs on things about lobotomy, about Walter Friedman, the man who invented the procedure and went around toured around the country lobotomizing people, but also like the memoir of Howard Dully, who was lobotomized as a young kid, as a like I think he was like 12 or 13, early, like a young sort of teenager. But no, I haven't seen the any videos of.
There's a video of a guy and he just sounds like there's just something like if he's like talking through like a muffle, it's just like they would ask him a question, be like, I'm fine. And it just sounds like plain, just like nothing, like just gray. Everything feels gray, everything he's saying. And I have to think that you're looking through a testimony. If you could look at one before and then one after. I mean, is Walter Friedman that guy that had like no sleeves on when he would give a lobotomy? Like he was doing so many lobotomies that his sleeves were getting in the way. It was ridiculous.
Yeah, and he had real hairy arms, so I guess it didn't matter that he didn't have sleeves on. But
Well, they were
yeah,
openly
that's
doing
Walter.
it in New
Yeah,
York.
That's Walter Friedman.
That's
Yeah, he would drive around. He would drive to various institutions, spend a day there, lobotomize 50 or 60 people, and leave. With his ice pick, he used an ice pick to jam it through people's eye sockets. Um, but really, what he was doing was he was destroying the frontal lobes, the front part of the brain, and that's why people who have a lobotomy don't have any affect. They don't have any sort of emotion and things because of the brain damage that's incurred from the procedure. Um, and I think that speaks to a lot of what was called treatment for mental illness or mental health problems. Really was about subduing people. Was about making them docile and controlling their behavior, whether that was through various means over the years, through seclusion and restraint, through what they called hydrotherapy, using various forms of water, and then psych meds. Once Thorazine became available in 1954, it's been primarily psychiatric medications that have been used to. Some people call them chemically lobotomize people, to chemically restrain people. But and that's what shock therapy and lobotomy was also about too. It was about making people docile and controlling their behaviors.
like most people come up with a Coke flavor in the middle of the night, but this guy came up with a lobotomy. Did you look into how, like, did he randomly get a stroke of like, I mean, how do you test that in the beginning? Like, how do you just randomly come up with the thought of sticking an ice pick behind someone's eye and, scrambling the frontal lobe?
Yeah, I mean there was well, it's the same could be said for electric shock or even Thorazine. I mean, there was this. I think because mental health problems are so kind of dreaded in society, they're so feared by society that physicians were desperate to find treatments and and were willing to resort to drastic measures. And again, that's also because of the dehumanization of disabled people more generally and of institutionalized people with mental health problems more specifically. But so they were trying in the teens, 20s, 30s, they were trying all of these different approaches: surgery, shock therapy, putting people in a coma by giving them um, too much insulin coma therapy. They thought that that would be a way of quieting people's delusional thinking or the hallucinations that they were having. And they didn't really know why it would work, but they thought that it might work, and so they tried to use it. And so there were all of these kind of ideas about that mental health problems were rooted in the brain, and so it's the brain is the place where we need to act. The brain is where we need to take to try to you know um, use our treatments to affect people. And so yeah, they would just experiment with different ways of altering the brain. And then so Friedman and his assistant just started thinking about um, the frontal lobe, and the idea that that might have um, effects on the way people thought and behaved and felt and acted. And then thought, well, if we alter the structure of the frontal lobe, maybe we can change the way people think and behave. And
We could
so
have gotten, or we could have gone a wrong direction in our society. Because if you really look at like the guidelines of like, what do you deem, is this just because you can't deal with this person? Like, that's the thing. It's like, what are you calling a disability? Is it the fact of like, I don't really like how this person acts. Maybe we should just give them a lobotomy. Or is this person a danger to themselves and others, which is a true ethical, serious concern. But then there's a thing of like, I don't really like his personality. He's way too energetic. Maybe we could tone him down a little bit. Like that is kind of where the line gets drawn a little bit, which is we could have went a completely wrong direction in our society. I mean, today's not perfect, but it's a hell of a lot better than what could have happened if we would have just anybody that had a problem we didn't like, had a social issue we didn't like, we get rid of them. Now at least we're using psychedelics and other forms of therapy to be able to, because there are serious, my friend's mom was schizophrenic, and she took her own life. So there are real issues that we need to deal with, and we need to talk about. Is this person a danger to themselves and others? How can we treat and how can we help them? But not labeling every single thing as a disability. I mean, even in some conversations I've had, ADHD getting labeled as a disability, certain forms of bipolar. And obviously there's varying degrees, but I mean, there's been this workout or this workaround of trying to figure out. And now it's like we are going, I would say, the opposite way, and extreme care, which I think is good too, but it also starts labeling even the smallest little bits of things as a disability, which in some sense can hurt the actual, people who are dealing with a severe disorder, where it's like now this umbrella term kind of trying to cover everything might actually devalue some of the disability aspects of things.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's a really good point. I think that the way we define disability is really important, and who we think is capable or eligible of being in society and participating in society is really important. And it's affected the way we treat people, and not only on kind of an interpersonal level, but the way the state and other actors have treated people over the years. So in the late 19th century, cities enacted what one historian has called the ugly laws, where they were laws about begging. They were, ostensibly designed to prevent people from begging, but really what it was to try to remove unsightly people from the streets, and those were usually disabled people who were disabled in some way, either missing a limb or blind or something. So there were actual laws that were put in place to remove them from the streets. And so I think we sort of developed this kind of narrow idea about what is normal and what is normal behavior. And certainly there are very serious things that we need to think about, like if somebody is going to harm themselves or others. We definitely have to think about that, but we have to think about, I think, more creative ways to intervene, in their lives, and especially in a moment of crisis. For example, just this week, Mayor Eric Adams in New York City announced this measure that he's going to enable the police to commit people involuntarily to a mental hospital if they're in the subway or on the streets. And even if they don't necessarily, even if they aren't posing a threat to anyone, if the cops think that they're in need of quote care, they can involuntarily commit them. And I think this is a problematic thing to do. I mean, I think we need something other than police forces, something other than police to actually help people when they're in crisis. And we need to support people in ways that would prevent these moments of crisis. Provide mental health support, housing support, food support if they need it, healthcare if they need it, and not just use the police to actually remove them from the streets. I don't think that that's an answer. And the one final thing I would say to your point that you made is I think too we have to think about how things like race and gender and class affect or become part of the way we think about disability, and especially mental health. So, for example, a white man who is, very active and assertive, and you know, um, isn't might not be seen as problematic, but a woman or a woman of color, who acts in similar ways might be seen as problematic, might be called manic, might be called quote crazy. And so we have to think about how gender and race, I think, factor into the way we think about disability and mental health problems, because ultimately, I think these things are defined socially. They're defined by society and by you know the ways in which we think people should be and act in society. And so I think we need to think about those other issues as well.
when most people get a crumb on the counter, they wipe it off the counter onto the floor and then just kind of forget about it and go away. And that's kind of what people or in power, I would say, have learned to kind of do with just issues that they want gone. Like, I mean, homeless people, put them in an institution, criminalizing them or putting them in jail. I mean, if they're not, if you lock them in jail, then release them and they go back out on the street again, they didn't learn their problems. So let's just get rid of them. And that's the easiest way besides killing them, which hopefully that's not happening, but it is that aspect of like, I don't want to deal with this problem. I don't want to see it anymore. It's kind of this entitled attitude. And I think that comes from lack of education. Not saying that these people don't have a college degree or something, but do we as a society really understand the full grasp of disabilities as someone like yourself who might study it? I mean, no, but I also think that the basic functions can be taught. Here's the shocking history of it. Here's what we started to change, and here's what we can be doing better. That's three really simple things that I feel like every institution, or not even institution, every education place, higher education, lower education, even basic functions in class should just be taught of like, I've had kids in my class that have disabilities, severe disabilities, where they get up and start screaming and having these giant temper tantrums. Like, what do you do? And it's when you start seeing people that are actually trying to help rather than just trying to get them away or out of the room or something. It's just like calm the person down. It's like I saw my fourth grade teacher do that. Kid had a freak out. Kid punched him in the face. The dude grabbed him. I didn't know, but the fourth grade teacher I had, Mr. Booth, he had a kid that was disabled, so he knew about things like this, and he handled it in the most professional way possible. But I was in fourth grade, and that still has an impact on me where I'm like, okay, if he can do that, we can all do a little bit on just trying to at least convenience or be able to make their lives a little bit easier or help them out if they need help and not try and, make a giant scene and pull our phones out about it. And I think that comes from education.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think, educating ourselves about disability history, but and then also just educating ourselves about the world around us would help a lot. It would go a long way in, in I think shaping the way we think about all of the different people that we encounter throughout our lives. I think that would be it's a really important step that we need to take, and I think conversations like this one hopefully will help people to think in new ways or in different ways about some of these issues.
When it came to your research or diving down this subject, I mean, did your perspective change from the beginning to where you're at now? Just, I mean, even you mentioned reading testimonies of people with disabled or disabilities, and they were kind of very specific. And like, it seems like this person might not be disabled, but you're not gonna read it if you're already thinking this came from a person who was disabled. Most people be like, "You just toss that out." But when you start reading the descriptions, I mean, we know about, I mean, they're not necessarily all disabled people, but idiot savants. I mean, I feel like that did somewhat of a help to get people interested and at least understanding a little bit more. Like, okay, maybe we might have painted the brush too soon, and this person isn't what we labeled them. They could actually, they might have some other function or some other thing about them that is very, very powerful and can impact a society in such a way. I'm just curious to what your perspective was from the very beginning, when you got started compared to where you're at now.
Yeah, well, I think probably one of the most profound changes is when I first began researching and thinking. I kind of was of the mind that people were either disabled or not disabled, and it was fairly easy to determine based, intuitively or just based on kind of cultural norms and stuff. I thought basically people were either disabled or not disabled. And then what I've realized over the years is that there are so many kind of fine gradations of disability like that we all kind of exist on a spectrum, so to speak, and that disabilities can be apparent in some cases, they can be completely invisible in some cases. Disabilities can arise in some situations and not in other situations, and that disability always has to be considered in connection with race and class and gender, because that influences how we think about disability and disabled people. And so I think that was the most profound change. And so, and my most recent research, some people might say, well, those people aren't mad, they're not insane, they're not crazy. But I would argue, yes, they were. I mean, many of them were suicidal, severely depressed, overwhelmed by anxiety. overwhelmed by grief. Some of them had delusions. Some had hallucinations. Many attempted to commit suicide. And so I would say yes. They very much were, and many of them admitted that they were. They would use the word insane or mad, but they wouldn't use the kind of more specific terms that we use today. But even though but despite that, even though they had those experiences, they're also quite normal in many ways. They had families, they had siblings, they were parents, they were sons and daughters, they worked, they were members of their communities, and so thinking in those more complex ways, I think, is the kind of the most profound change that I've had in my own thinking over the years.
This might branch out a little bit more from the historian aspect, but when it comes to listening to family members talk about, being a family member that has like a severe disability, so not necessarily from the disability person themselves, but just a family member that has, is trying to work through it and trying to their best. Did you ever look into those? Because there's a really good book I read in like middle school called Cruise Control, and it's about this brother who's like a star athlete and everything, and his other brother is in a wheelchair and like talks about drooling on himself all the time and like severely disabled. But he talks about like the pain that he has to go through. And the author made a second book, which was from the disabled kid's point of view, where he was like really intelligent inside of his head, but he couldn't get his words out. And, his body just had no connection to that aspect. And it just, I mean, it was so eye opening where, I mean, at any point, did you start looking through some of these family members and trying to get, a better perspective of what they were dealing with and trying to understand it from that viewpoint as well?
I do, yeah. I think it's really important because I think disability and disabilities are not experienced in isolation. I think one of the things that the medical model of disability would like us to believe is that disabilities are only experienced within our own bodies, that it's just something we have that's inside our own body and we have to deal with it on our own. But that couldn't be further from the truth. I think this more social way of thinking about disability, kind of tells us that disability is experienced within families, it's experienced within communities and societies and at various levels. And so yeah, I've been really mindful both historically and in like when I study more contemporary stuff and write about more current times, and thinking about disability within the family and how it can affect everybody in the family, but also how family members can become allies. And sometimes also um, family members can become kind of the most restrictive or constraining forces in disabled people's lives because they're being overprotective or something like that. And so I think thinking about family is really important. And other scholars have said that as well, that we have to think about disabled families, we have to think about the kind of the family, um, and it doesn't always have to be traditional, mom, dad, children. Families, I think, can come in different forms, and sometimes disabled people will form their own families once they become older, either with other disabled people or with friends and things. So there's different forms that family can take, but I think it's really important, and I try to think about that a lot. And I think it's also, I wanted to just say too that I think the fact that you read books like that is I think a really good sign of the way things are changing. Because when I was little, in grade school, we didn't have books like that. And if they existed, most mainstream kids in school were not aware of them. And we didn't really have disabled kids in our classrooms. They were still largely segregated. So I think we have come quite a long way, but I do think we still have a lot of work to do.
And this is just one last question for you, but when it comes to some of the medical interventions, did you look into any of, I guess, the styles that they use today when it comes to psychedelics or just other exploration? I mean, I know they tried LSD in the 50s, but I mean, just modern forms now. I've talked to so many people from psychedelic research to you name it, and it's kind of like, I mean, it's just interesting to see how it took so long to finally get here, but at least we're starting to pick up some ground in some aspects. I mean, I always worry about the people who deal with schizophrenia because they take a pill and that's kind of it. And sometimes it's like a cure all, and sometimes they end up needing to bump up the dosage, and even that doesn't work sometimes. And it's like, I mean, hopefully we'll have a cure for all of it eventually. But just that kind of cusp of like, let's just start trying some, things that aren't dangerous. They're, pretty basic. Marijuana is okay. I don't smoke, but if somebody has schizophrenia and it helps them out, for the love of God, do it.
Well, yeah, I mean, kind of how I feel too. And I have really brilliant colleagues. And I think you might have interviewed Erica Dick, the Canadian scholar. I have really her and David Hertzberg. I have do the history of drugs, and I don't really do the history of drugs. I mean, I've read quite a bit of secondary literature about drugs, but I think folks like Erica Dick and David Hertzberg have really kind of done a lot to trouble the idea between licit and illicit drugs. You know, this idea that some drugs are good and they're medications and other drugs are bad and they're illicit, they're illegal. And I think we're starting to kind of blur those boundaries now. We're starting to break down that divide a bit, but I still think a lot of work needs to be done. And I think people need to be open minded and, try to figure out what works best for them. Because, like you said, oftentimes, even if we go through a medical setting, physicians and other prescribers are just, they're trying different combinations and different dosages, until they figure something out that works. And so it's not really very scientific at all. And we don't really know how or why certain drugs have the effects they have. And so I think that, being open-minded and thinking about various remedies, various therapies, whether it be chemical or meditation or other types of mindfulness sort of therapy and training, I think all of that, we should try to pursue all of that. And I think that it should also be funded. I mean, I think that, you know, um, healthcare providers, and I think we should have universalized healthcare, but I think, we need to look into more ways to fund treatments and therapies that are now considered, alternative, and not always just relying on biomedicine to treat disability and mental health.
We need private organizations that don't have to worry about funding just strictly from a government or from a certain state director. Um, I've talked to, like I said, Nancy Weiss when she was on here, and when she was talking about the Rotenberg Center, and the FDA took the Rotenberg Center to court and they lost. They're like, the FDA is out of their jurisdiction. I'm like, that's not a good thing. And you ask, how are these institutions able to remain open, at least one as bad as that? And like, well, the guy who created it is connected with a lot of Supreme Court judges and things of that sort. I'm just like, that sounds like a movie. But then, like, I mean, but it's real. I mean, we know about, obviously there's, lobbying and all that, but that gets into a dangerous area where I just try and express the point, when someone's choking on something, if you don't know how to do the Heimlich, you're just going to panic. So let's start figuring out ways that we can try and educate ourselves more on the aspect of, when someone has a disability, what do you know about that disability? What are they dealing with? What might they be dealing with? Give a feel for it so you don't just freak out if someone has a seizure. I mean, when I learned CPR, it was like I could save anybody's life. But it was when you really, now you know what to do when something does happen. I mean, it's a scary moment indeed, but I think, when someone has a seizure, someone has epilepsy, their danger. I mean, when they can't drive, they just lose things. And it's like, what are you, just isolating them to their house? I get that they can't drive, but you hear the positive ideas these people have about, yeah, I can't drive, but I can still, carpool, hang out with friends. And it's like, that's what should be taught, is like, hey, it's not over. We're not just going to lock you down. We're going to try and find ways to make sure that you can still experience the life that you want to experience.
Well, that's really important, and I think it's a really good point to make even towards the end of this conversation. I mean, because, well, first of all, I think, if we had better public transportation, we wouldn't have to rely so much on driving, and that's kind of a really important but more minor point. But the larger point I wanted to make, in response to your comment, is that, I think it's absolutely important and essential that we have education, but that disabled people themselves are at the center of creating that education and creating that conversation and that dialogue. Disabled activists since the 1990s or 80s have had this slogan, nothing about us without us. And what they mean by that is that, disabled people have been left out of the conversation and have been segregated from society for so long that they really need to be made part of the conversation, and not only part of the conversation but leaders of the conversation, because otherwise we run the risk of exploiting and objectifying disabled people in the name of helping them. We want to create awareness and what we call quote awareness and quote tolerance and these types of things, but if that isn't done, with disabled people at the center of that conversation and with disabled people leading those conversations, then I think, sometimes, there might be bad results.
We just can't have the model style we've been having for so long, which is just cut off the leg to save the rest of the body. I didn't notice this until after I graduated, but all those little special classes that I got sent to with people that my reading level was really high. I just had ADHD. Trying to get me to sit down and read a book was impossible. And then one of my teachers was like, "That's why we send you to the special class for an hour so I can teach the rest of the class." And I go, "Oh my god, I thought that was like a cool little getaway," and I was like tricked in this, but that's real, and that's how it's always is. It's isolate, certain individuals that are kind of holding people back or deemed as they seem as they're holding them back. It's not true, which I think we should sculpt our classes around that individual. And that's, I mean, some people can say that's not fair, but I go, I mean, they're still going to be able to learn. I mean, each individual student is going to be doing their own assignments anyway in the end, but if you're taking it at a pace where at least everyone is comprehending a little bit of what's going on, especially something like ADHD. I mean, that's not as bad as like a severe handicap, but I don't know. Maybe one day we'll get there.
Yeah, well, and I think we need to have, and people are moving toward this kind of universally designed curriculum and universally designed classrooms where they are more inclusive and they think about different types of learning, different learning styles, different approaches to absorbing material, different ways of receiving instruction. And I think more teachers are becoming aware of that at the K through 12 level and at the post secondary level, colleges and universities. And but that's kind of a newer development, within the last 10 or 20 years. And so I think that's going to take some time to gain increased traction. But I think you're right. I mean, I think we do need to design our classrooms and our society to so that they're more inclusive of, different types of people.
Well, just like celebrities speaking out about stuff. There's a comedian you should look up. He had a podcast episode on Joe Rogan. His name is Ron Funches. He has a kid with a disability, and he talked about when his kid graduated high school. They gave him a certificate for graduating high school, and the people sat him down and go, "Yeah, but this isn't like a real certificate. You know that, right?" And in his head, he just goes, "Oh my God, no, my kid's going to go to college. My kid's going to get his educate." And it's just like hearing someone talk like that, at least from like a I wouldn't say from a comedian aspect, but just from that side of things where you start realizing there's a whole other host of things besides, dealing with issues in public or something like that. It's just an aspect of like my kid was going to get the proper life he deserves. I'll pay whatever it costs for to be able to do that. And just hearing someone speak like that, I mean, for someone like myself who doesn't have kids or doesn't have like, a kid with a disability, that is a big impact for, a younger generation, I would say too, for just someone like a celebrity or someone like that speaking like that.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good development since the passage of the ADA in 1990. That I mean, this is now an ADA world, a post ADA world, and so there's so many more people are speaking out about disability, either their own disability or the disability of family members, and so now we're starting to have role models, and people are, we're starting to see people on TV and in movies, and there's much more positive portrayals of disability, and so I think that that's a really positive change as well. That we have these kind of some, just younger disabled people might have people they can look up to and say, if that person can succeed and go to college and be successful, then so can I. And so I think that's really important too.
Well, Mike, I really appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. Is there a place where people can find any of your links?
Um, they can just go to University of Buffalo. They could Google University of Buffalo or Google Mike Rembis, and they'll find me.
Got a Twitter?
I'm not, unfortunately. I'm probably the last person that's not on Twitter. Although since Elon bought it, I'm not sad that I'm not on Twitter. I don't know. I worry for the future of Twitter if Elon stays in charge.
Well, I'm
Uh,
gonna link all your books and your profile on Buffalo in the description below. And I appreciate the time you gave me to chat. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode. Out of the blank.